You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
This is Inside the Village for the week of April 20th, 2023. I'm Scott Sexsmith alongside Village Media Editor-in-Chief Michael Friscolanti and Executive Producer Derek Turner. Guys, good to have you with us. It's a very special day here inside the Village.
Special indeed, and not because I'm not sitting with you.
Well, I was going to say, this is kind of weird because this is the first time and we should tell everybody, today we are marking our first anniversary of the show. Hard to believe. But this is the first time that the three of us have not been in this room together.
I know, it was not done on purpose. That's not how I'm trying to celebrate our first anniversary, by being as far away from you as possible. Just, unforeseen circumstances sometimes keep us apart, Scott.
But nonetheless, it's great to be with you guys, even if it's not in person. Okay, hard to believe. It's been a year. I think before we move forward and talk about what's on tap for today, maybe we take a minute or two and step back and talk about the year that's been and maybe a show or two or a guest that has stood out and resonated with each of you. Frisco, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I've said it before. I think the thing for me is that the show was kind of born out of some quick ideas. We said, hey, let's give this a shot. We brainstormed for a couple of weeks. We did some practice runs. And I was nervous as hell. I didn't think it would be a winner, to be honest. I thought that, maybe I didn't have the chops to do this gig. But the more we rolled into it and started getting some guests on who were really talking about some important, interesting, and sometimes humorous things, right? I think it really started to come together. We've done some hard news pieces talking about some difficult issues. We've had some comedians come on and talk. And I think we've always tried to have the idea that A, we want to talk about things that people in the province are talking about. And B, we want to give a platform to the great journalism we're doing across the chain at Village Media. And I think my favorite part of the show is at the beginning when we just talk about some of the great work we've done. And so in that sense, it's been great. I think it's I don't want to say it's given our brand a bit more exposure, but I do think it has. I think people know a little bit more about Village Media because of the podcast.
Absolutely. And it's hard to believe that it was a year ago today that the three of us were in this room filming the first episode of Inside the Village. And the story topic, I believe, was the search for Katrina. And you talk about difficult topics. That was certainly one of them. I'm very proud of the work that we do here each and every week. And, of course, the finishing touches, kudos, of course, all go to Derek Turner, executive producer, who puts this show together week in and week out. Derek, you have a behind-the-scenes view, of course, certainly no stranger to the audience, as you'll interject from time to time, and we'll include you where we can. Anything stand out to you over the last year?
To me, Scott, further to what Frisco said, was introducing the personality of our guests to our viewers and listeners, something that might not come across on a written word, but when you get to actually hear their stories in their own voices, I think it speaks a lot to the kind of people they are. And I think particularly of Canada's youngest 649 winner, Juliette L'Amour, Ryan Willis, the head of the Bigfoot Foundation at Brock University, and Mayor Diane Therrien from Peterborough with the F-bombs, and those are a few that really stand out to me, and I feel like it was their personalities that really made those episodes special.
Absolutely, well said. Here's to another year of Inside the Village with these two beauties that I get to spend each and every week with. All right, speaking of awards, Frisco, I understand that we've picked up a few in the last week or so across the network.
Yeah, it was a good week at the Ontario Community Newspaper Association's Better Newspapers competition. Our team from Pelham Today, previously the Voice of Pelham, I want to make sure I get this right. They were a huge winner at the awards. They took home 2 golds, 2 silvers, and 1 bronze. So congrats to Dave Burkett and his team over at Pelham Today, which is our newest site. If you haven't checked it out, you should. Another really cool thing from that awards ceremony is 2 of our own at Village Media were inducted into the OCNA Hall of Fame. Abbas Hamayed, who works at Sudbury.com, publisher at Sudbury.com, and Michael Atkins, the former owner of Sudbury.com, who's now a board member for Village Media. They were both inducted. That's a very high honor. Really shows the many years that they've put into the news industry in Ontario. So congratulations to them, and congratulations to the team in Pelham.
All right, absolutely. Let's kick off with the first word to Frisco and some breaking news, starting with a plane going off the runway in Sault Ste. Marie.
Yeah, it was I shouldn't say it was a great week for covering breaking news, but that is what we do. And it was a great week for covering breaking news. One of them was a Porter Airline flight coming in from Toronto and the Sioux landed and just kept going and skidded off the runway into the grass. The Transportation Safety Board is now investigating. Darren Taylor, one of our reporters at Sioux Today, was on it, had some interviews with passengers and kind of got some great photos and videos, some images from the scene, kind of led the way on that. Another breaking story this week that we've all read about is the Gateway Casino's cyber attack around Ontario. Knocked out Casino Rama among them, the casino in Sault Ste. Marie. Dave Dawson, our editor at Aurelia Matters, was on this story on Sunday. We got the breaking news up, was shared across our site. And this is the key mission of what we do, is bring you breaking news in our communities, and those were two fantastic examples.
And it's interesting, the cyber attack story, and of course Derek alluded to some of the great guests that we've had over the past year. Cy Huda, a cyber attack specialist, was certainly one of them.
Yeah, and if you go back and you could click on Inside the Village on any of our sites, you can go back and see that episode. He kind of saw this. He's been living this for years. He knew that there were going to be many more of these types of attacks, and obviously this is one of those examples. Definitely, he was one of our guests that I enjoyed the most. Super smart guy, and really gave us a window into a world that we really didn't understand. And sorry to jump around, but just to go back to what Derek said too about Juliette Lamour, that was a great moment for our show too, because that was kind of a big kind of Canada exclusive for us. This story went all over. Her story went all over the world.
Worldwide,
right?
Yeah.
This 18-year-old who's never bought a lottery ticket in her life buys one because her grandfather suggested she do it. First ever ticket, wins one of the largest prizes in Ontario history for Lotto 649. And she gave one interview in the world, and that was to us at Inside the Village. And it got a ton of traction for us, and really I gave her a chance to tell her story. So I know I'm jumping around, but that was really a highlight, and it's one of the things that we're starting to do on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift gears and move to Newmarket. Our editor at Newmarket today, Deb Kelly, has a great feature that she runs called When Ends Don't Meet.
Yeah, and I talk a lot about how each of our sites sort of does their job in a different way, and looks at different angles and covers their community in a special way. And this series, When Ends Don't Meet, is something that Deb started to really tackle the affordability crisis in her community, and like whether it's the inflation rate or lack of affordable housing. The latest story by Joseph Quigley is about a mother who's fallen victim to what we now know is widespread around Ontario, the rent eviction problem, where landlords are evicting people for the sole purpose of renovating the units and then charging much higher rents to somebody else. But we talk all the time about how do we cover these important issues that are constant, like the cost of living crisis in Ontario. And this series that Deb and her team has been working on is really a great example. So it's a real service to our readers in Newmarket, for sure.
Absolutely. And that story in Newmarket that you speak of, Kristen Ham was the tenant, and her rent went from $1,500 to $2,500 a month. Crazy. And finally, nice to see the debut of another big read.
Yeah, I hope people across the chain had a chance to read this. Keegan Kozelenka and Taylor Pace, working out of Guelph today and Alora Fergus today, have been piecing together this story for months about sort of the root of all the protests we're seeing at drag story times around the province, particularly at public libraries, where drag queens are reading to children. These are wonderful family-friendly events. Yet there's been these, very angry protests at a lot of these. We've seen it in a lot of our communities. And they sort of took a real deep dive into what's triggering this, what's causing this, what the concerns are. They spoke to tons of experts, tons of people involved on all sides of this, and really pieced together a really informative story. And as I've said to people, as someone who follows the news closely and reads the news, I've read all about it and seen the protests, but I didn't really quite get what was fueling all this. And their story really lays it out, sort of the root of this. And it's an excellent read. And to top it all off, our design team, specifically Danielle Fleming and Dennis Houle, did an amazing job putting together a graphic, like a piece of art, a very magazine-y style piece of art to lead the coverage, to top off the coverage. And it's just a wonderful piece. So I encourage everyone, if they have it, it's ran on all our sites. I encourage everyone to take a read and really understand what's going on here.
All right, good stuff. The first word to Frisco. Okay, pal, coming up on today's show, we're going to be joined by Stephen Schreibman, who is a lawyer with the law firm of Goldblatt Partners. And he's representing one of two groups where alternative level of care patients is concerned. It's going to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, for sure. This is the story that people have been talking a lot about lately, about how the Ontario government now has the power to move patients, elderly patients, out of the hospital into long-term care homes that they may not even choose. Could be, hundreds of kilometers away from home. And if they don't go, then the hospital has the power to charge them $400 a day while they stay in the hospital. And this is a story that Jessica Smith-Cross, our editor-in-chief at the Trillium, has been covering closely, and covered the recent announcement of this charter challenge. So it'd be interesting to dive into this and kind of understand what's going on.
All right, Stephen Schreibman joins us next when Inside the Village returns.
Reporters, editors, and journalists who go the extra mile to get the story and get it right. Go behind the scenes with those who cover the stories that matter most to you and your community. Look for it in the Village Features section of your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to Inside the Village alongside Michael Friscolanti, editor-in-chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Pleased to be joined on the program now by Stephen Schreibman, a partner at the law firm Goldblatt Partners, located in Ottawa and Toronto. Stephen, welcome to Inside the Village. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, pleased to join you.
Stephen, let's start with the basics. Introduced by Doug Ford's government, the More Beds, Better Care Act came into force, I believe, last September. What was the purpose of the bill, and what problem in the healthcare system was it supposed to solve?
Well, one of the interesting things about the bill is that it doesn't actually set out a purpose. But, from reading what the government has had to say about the bill, it's about freeing up beds in the hospitals that are being occupied by patients who are designated ALC, needing an alternative level of care to the care that's available in the particular hospital setting they find themselves in. These are folks that are waiting to get into a long-term care home, and as probably most of your listeners understand, there are very long wait lists to get into these homes. And so the bill ostensibly is intended to move patients out of those beds into long-term care homes, though you have to ask yourself where the vacancies are, given the fact that there might be 40,000 people in Ontario at any given time waiting for a bed in the home. And so that's what arguably the government is seeking to do. We don't think the bill is necessary. We think it offends basic constitutional rights that have been recognized repeatedly by the Supreme Court of Canada, that accords people the right to determine where they live, the care they're going to receive. And we don't think it's necessary. And so that has inspired a challenge to the bill based on what we contend are breaches of fundamental constitutional rights that everyone in Ontario enjoys or should enjoy.
And before we get into the charter challenge, just simply put, this bill allows the government to move patients to places they may not want to go to, right? It gives them the power to be able to move them sometimes many kilometers away from their home. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly what it does. So if you're waiting for a bed in a long-term care home, there's a long wait list. Someone in Home and Community Support Services says to you, well, you're not going to get into that home or those homes. We want you to move to another home, a home that the patient or the patient's family may have decided just simply isn't able to provide proper care to the patient. I think everybody knows about the calamitous performance of long-term care homes in the province during the pandemic, or it's simply too far from their spouse who may still be living at home, or their family who in many cases are not only important to the well-being of patients or residents in long-term care homes, but also necessary to their care. So the government's saying, okay, we're going to move you whether you want to go or not. And if you don't consent, we're going to choose a home for you. You're not going to be included in the process of selecting a home. And ultimately, if you refuse to go to a home that we've chosen for you, we will bill you $400 a day for every day you stay in the hospital. That's basically the gist of the bill.
When you explain it that way, it's shocking that that's going on in our province, right? It is. I think a lot of people would not even know that that's happening. And you represent one of the two public health advocacy groups that have launched this charter challenge, correct?
Correct.
And what's at the core of the charter challenge? What are you arguing?
Well, we're arguing that, and we have a fair bit of evidence to support our contentions. So some of the leading experts in this field, Dr. Samir Sinha, Ahmed Arya, George Heckman, have given evidence that the consequences of this bill, moving patients into homes that can't care for them or that are too far from families that may be necessary for their care and support, will actually increase the suffering of these patients and in some cases hasten their death. So the leading authorities on these issues, palliative care and geriatric doctors, say this is going to be a disaster for some patients. So that's the gist of the constitutional challenge, because under the charter, everyone in Canada is entitled to have their life, liberty, and security of their person guarded and not to be deprived thereof, but in accordance with fundamental justice. Those are the terms of Section 7 of the Charter. And we're also alleging that the bill infringes Section 15, which entitles everybody to equality rights. And it's only this group of patients who are being deprived of the right to consent to the care they're going to receive and where they're going to live, and whether their personal health information is shared with others. We all enjoy those rights under the law. Only this group is being deprived of those rights. So that's the essence of the complaint.
Stephen, at a press conference announcing the Charter Challenge, you certainly did not mince words. You called the More Beds, Better Care Act a, quote, flashing neon light of a bold lie.
It's I practiced public interest law for 40 years, 20 of it as an environmental lawyer. The last 20 doing a whole range of things, from the sale of Hydro One, which we managed to stop in, I think, 2001. Of course, it's gone through subsequently. Voter suppression rules put in place by the Harper government. Lots of polluting and indifferent conduct by private companies. But I've never encountered anything that's just so cynical and so cruel in its impact on the most vulnerable people in our community. These patients in hospitals just are very ill and don't have very long to live. About 20% of them, according to our experts, are in the last 3 months of their lives. If they succeed in getting into a home, they will join a population that has a life expectancy of 18.7 months. So the government's decided to, in a way, pick on this group of vulnerable patients who occupy about 1 in 20 beds in Canadian hospitals. It's not a huge number. Kind of make them out to be the cause of the problems in the healthcare system. And there are lots of problems. But if anything, this group of patients are the victims of those problems. If there was better home care, many of them wouldn't end up in the hospital in the first place. Many of them have been designated ALC when they actually aren't ALC. They still need care in the hospital, and our experts describe cases like that. And then, of course, there is a whole group who would like to get into a long-term care home. They don't want to stay in the hospital, but there are no beds in a long-term care home that can actually provide for their care. So this group is being singled out, kind of identified as selfish bed blockers, and maybe that will distract people from how little the government's doing to actually deal with the systemic problems of the system that has given rise to the predicament that a lot of people find themselves in, but particularly this group of very old and frail and elderly people.
When you look at the numbers, you do get the sense that this group is being scapegoated, because I think, according to the reports at the press conference at the time, about 66 to 70 people have been moved so far by this bill. I mean, it's not a massive amount of people that are holding up, hundreds and hundreds of beds.
Well, the claims vary. I mean, I think it was like 2 months in, it might have been November of last year, and the government was saying, well, they've moved 2,400 people already. The numbers are all over the map. There's very little transparency to know what it is that's actually going on. We'll get there in this litigation process. But at this point, we don't know. What we do know from the experts and from the patients we've spoken with, they don't want to stay in a hospital. Most of them want to go home. There isn't enough support for home care to allow them to do that. So they're hoping to get into a long-term care home. And many of them have been waiting on a list to get into one for months and even years. So they're hardly the cause of the problems in the system. And I think the 66 number might be those patients that really refuse to consent to what home and community care wanted them to agree to, and they were moved anyway. We have evidence from Dr. St. Martin. He's a doctor who works in long-term care and has for decades near Sudbury, who just describes the kind of people that he says are just being dumped into long-term care homes that can't care for them. Psychiatric patients, patients with Down syndrome, people with criminal records of violent offenses who can't, he believes, be admitted to a home because they represent a security threat to other people in the home. Just all kinds of people, I guess the system doesn't really have a way to properly care for and just get, as he describes, dumped into long-term care homes. And one of the things I've learned about the long-term care system in Ontario is that there's no upper limit on the kind of care that the home might be expected to provide, like to a psychiatric patient or someone suffering, but of course can't. It's underfunded, it's under-resourced. Our experts tell us that even the best homes in the province, and one of our key affiants, Dr. Ahmed Arya, works in one of the most popular and successful homes in Toronto, says it's just a very difficult problem to properly staff the homes, have nursing care on site that's needed when it's needed. So even the best are struggling. And you can guess where the empty beds are that these people are being coerced into going to. Can I say one more thing about the 66 number?
Certainly, yeah, go ahead.
The bill is intended, when it works, to simply coerce people into agreeing to placements in homes they don't want to go to. So you're not going to find the government or hospitals imposing the $400 a day daily charge very often, if at all. The bill isn't working if that happens. If you're in a long-term, if you're in an acute or a post-acute care bed and you're on a wait list for a long-term care home, it's too long, HCCSS will come to you and say, look, either you can agree to go to a home we've chosen for you, perhaps it's 60 kilometers from where your wife is residing, or you don't. But if you don't, you have no choice in the matter. We will choose for you and we will bill you if you don't go along. So I think what's going to be happening is in almost every case, people are going to say, well, okay, confronted with that alternative, I'll agree to what it is you're proposing.
That number, no matter how big or small, certainly to me seems not only outrageous, but unacceptable. I can't imagine that in the province of Ontario we're treating elderly individuals that way. Stephen, what are some of these patients actually saying to you?
Well, they're basically recounting very sad stories about trying to, the decline of someone they love and care about. We're often speaking to the family, not to the patient. I think a very significant number of these folks suffer from dementia. I've worked on healthcare issues for 20 years, but I haven't ever dealt with long-term care. And I didn't really understand how sick people are that get into long-term care. So many of them are suffering from dementia. Many of them have substitute decision makers. It's really their families that are trying to manage this crisis of care for someone they love who just been admitted to a hospital for acute care, and now the hospital is saying, "We've done everything we can for you. Time to go." And so they describe these sad and harrowing predicaments they find themselves in, and how much pressure they are under from the hospital to accede to a demand that, this loved one, their spouse or their parent, get moved out of the hospital ASAP or face the consequences, and feel compelled to agree to placements that are just very problematic. I'm working on preparing an affidavit for a woman who is 83. Her husband is 89. She has macular degeneration. She can't drive. Her husband was waiting for placement in a home near their community so she could visit every day. And they ended up having to agree to a placement in a home that is too far for her to get to on her own, and there's no public transit, so she has to hire a cab to take her and bring her back, or persuade one of her neighbors, who are often helpful, but still have to go with her and wait 2 or 3 hours while she visits her husband, who is suffering from dementia, who had a stroke and no longer can walk, so she couldn't take him home where they would like to have him, and suffers from acute anxiety, and is greatly comforted by visits from his wife, and would be also comforted by visits from his friends, and all of that has become just far more difficult. So that's a family that has some resources and that's able to cope. Even though, the patient and now the resident suffers as a result. But you can imagine for people who don't have the resources, whose family can't provide and visit daily. Our experts tell us that, there simply aren't staff in many of these homes to properly care for people. I'm repeating myself, but often families feel that void. They're there to help somebody eat, to attend to them, to care for them. And not only does that, of course, a great boon to a resident, but it also frees up staff to deal with other people in the home because they're under-resourced to begin with. And so when you move people far away from those supports, you just make life very difficult. Not only for the resident, but also for the homes that now have to provide care that could have been provided with support from the family.
Just hearing that story is devastating. Maybe it's an unfair comment to make, but you expect, the people in government who make decisions to not make decisions like that, right? You don't expect them to say, here's a solution. Let's send this elderly patient, 100 kilometers away from where all their support is, and that'll check a box on our paperwork, and we can move on to the next person. I think the average Joe just expects the government to do better than that, Stephen.
Yeah, I think the really unfortunate thing about this is, I think the calculus is that people just don't care about elderly, sick, and ill people in our society. And when they point to jurisdictions that are doing a much better job of long-term care, I know Denmark's often singled out, the explanation they offer is in Denmark, people care about older and ill people and expect them to be treated with respect and be treated well. It's just a cultural and social norm. I think this government may be counting on that not being as present in Canadian society, because it really begs explanation why you would proceed with something like this. And I think the other thing I mentioned in my press conference, because I've been around for so long, I remember a time in which politicians were expected to be honest with people. You could evade questions, you could omit things, you could spin, but you couldn't just kind of lie to people. And that's what the More Beds, Better Care Act is. It's like, that's the lie, and we'll put it out front as the marquee, because we know we're not creating any more beds with this bill, and we know no one's going to be provided. Certainly the ALC patients or these elderly patients are going to get less care, not more care. So why don't we call it the More Beds, Better Care Act? I mean, we've fallen some distance in terms of the norms of governance in the public interest, and any obligation a government feels to be candid and forthright with the people that elect them. That's a sad state of affairs, I'm afraid, we find ourselves in.
Stephen, through this process, I can't imagine some of the horror stories that you've seen firsthand. Any that you could share with Frisco and I and our audience?
We have, more of this evidence from the people on the receiving end of ALC patients who just can't be cared for in the home that they end up in. So I can't tell you very much without breaching confidentiality, but you'll have, for example, a Down syndrome patient who really should be in a specialized facility for their care, and instead ends up in a long-term care home where their behavior becomes a source of conflict with other residents, and where the staff aren't trained or equipped to deal with the particular needs of a Down syndrome patient. So what do you do in a situation like that where you can't provide the care someone with Downs requires? Is you lock them up. You put them under lock and key. So it's stories like that. It's stories of psychiatric patients who are placed in long-term care homes who will not provide for psychiatric care. The only thing the home can do is either lock them up or keep them heavily sedated. They're going to be there for an awfully long time, taking up a bed that, a lot of people who are elderly and really need care that long-term care homes can provide would otherwise occupy. It's stories like that.
I don't want to simplify things, but it, to me, begs the question, what in the hell is going on, and why is nobody standing up for these people?
Well, you've got the Ontario Health Coalition and the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly that have taken on the challenge of this constitutional case. So neither of them has resources. Advocacy Center for the Elderly is a legal clinic, but it doesn't have a litigation budget to embark upon anything like this. The Ontario Health Coalition is a citizens-based group that really cares, I would say almost desperately about the state of affairs of the Ontario healthcare system. That have also taken on this challenge. We contribute at the law firm in terms of reduced rates, but it's a substantial undertaking, and you've got groups and individuals and people who are parts of these coalitions or support the clinic that are determined to try to seek some justice and to protect the people that are affected by this, and to protect the people that are affected by this, justice for them and protection for them. So there are people out there that care and that are willing to make a pretty formidable commitment to trying to do something about this.
And what's the timeline of the charter challenge now, Stephen? Obviously, the government will have to submit their arguments and then a hearing, I assume?
Yeah, it takes a long time, unfortunately. We're going to argue that the process be expedited. It took us about 4 months to put all of the evidence together to support the claim. The Crown will now marshal its evidence in response. We'll probably have an argument with the Crown about how long that's going to take. I think optimistically, we might get to a hearing in court by the very end of this year, perhaps the beginning of next, but it'll be a struggle to get there. So we get their evidence. We may or may not want to reply to it. Then there are cross-examinations. Then there's the whole process of gathering all the material and all the evidence that's been advanced in support of our respective claims with respect to this legislation. Then there's writing legal argument, and then finally a hearing. Takes a while.
Yeah, and I doubt in the meantime, as we've seen, the government will rarely just suddenly change their mind and decide that you guys have it correct and they have it wrong.
Well, with a great faint hope I actually suggested that they consider suspending the application of the regulations until we have a chance to have a court weigh in and decide whether or not any of this is constitutional or not. I had to ask.
Yeah.
Well, good of you to do that. Stephen, before we let you go, is there anything that you want to add that maybe we didn't touch on that we should have?
No, I'm glad you're covering this issue. I really do think it's important. There's so much going on. It's easy to look away. When you take a closer look, this is really very disturbing and requires more attention than it's getting. So I appreciate your interest.
Absolutely. Stephen Schreibman, lawyer at Goldblatt Partners. Stephen, thanks for this. Thanks for joining us on Inside the Village today.
My pleasure.
For the latest in in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read. It's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Back to wrap on Inside the Village, the first year in the can, just like that. Derek Turner is here, executive producer, as is Michael Friscolanti, editor-in-chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Oh, and before I forget, because guys, it and Derek will tell you, it seems that I always tend to. ITV at villagemedia.ca. If you want to reach out to any of us, the email is wide open, 24 hours, 7 days a week.
And you know what? There should be some comments on this week's episode. I mean, that was a fascinating conversation with Stephen. I had an idea of what the legislation meant and the impacts it was having on some families, but some of the individual stories he told, and I think about, my own grandparents who have passed on, but a couple of them were in long-term care at the end. They were in a nursing home. They went from a hospital to a nursing home because we had no choice. And I just think of what it would have been like if we were told that the only one available, in the next city over or two cities over. And it's mind-boggling to me that that's the reality. And I think like Stephen said, maybe take that for granted and we think we know it's happening, but it's not something we're talking about.
It almost seems unfathomable, that almost movie-like, that the government can step in and say, no, we're going to take you from here and we're going to put you over here and you're going to like it.
Yeah. And I don't promise to know the answers, because if the pandemic showed us anything, it was just how bad the long-term care system was, right? I mean, it definitely pulled the bandage off the problems that were going on in long-term care facilities in Ontario. So I don't know the answer. I don't pretend to know the answer, but I'm pretty sure the answer isn't, hey, let's take this 85-year-old woman and put her 300 kilometers away from where her 85-year-old husband is, who wants to come and visit her.
Absolutely. That makes no sense whatsoever. All right. We are back next Wednesday with another episode of Inside the Village. You can get a year's worth at insidethevillage.ca, across the Village Media Network, and, of course, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. For executive producer Derek Turner, editor-in-chief Michael Friscolanti, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Thanks for watching for a year, and we'll talk to you next week.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe, provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.